There are a few things that sort of come to mind immediately for me when I'm thinking about 2017. The first is that this will be the first democratic transition that Liberia has had where a sitting head of state actually transitions to another sitting head of state. In recent memory, that is. So in the 1970s, President William Tubman died in office, and he'd been president for almost 30 years. Following him, his successor was his vice president, William Tolbert, who was assassinated while still in office. Following him was Samuel Kanyan-Doe, who was also assassinated in office during the war. And then following him, obviously notoriously, was Charles Taylor, who didn't serve his last term, but was indicted by the the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and eventually had to go to the ICC, or the Hague, and was eventually prosecuted and found guilty for crimes committed in Sierra Leone. So he didn't serve his full term and certainly didn't transition to a democratically elected president. So for me, the stakes are incredibly high, not only politically, but also historically, looking at our historical trajectory. I think the other thing that's important to look at is there will be no incumbent in this election. President Sirleaf has definitively stated that she will step down. She was going to abide by the Constitution. She served her 12 years, and she's going to step aside and allow the political dispensation to take its course. But her vice president is running. And so I almost think of him as sort of a pseudo-incumbent, even though he's not really an incumbent. So, that has all kinds of implications about what kinds of state resources he might employ in order to get a bit of an edge ahead of all of the other candidates. So we don't want to discount that there's a pseudo-incumbency, is a term that I've sort of created. I think one thing that's also really important looking ahead is virtually all the candidates who are vying for president have definitively stated that they'll be running. Now, there are a lot of the usual suspects, right? So the seasoned politicians, so the Charles Brumskin and the vice president. The George Weah, you could even say, is a seasoned politician because he's been around the block a few times. But what, for me, is fascinating is that there are new people, sort of new aspirants coming to the fore. And many of them are not seasoned politicians. Many of them are technocrats. Many of them are entrepreneurs. They run their own businesses. One particular man is Benani Ure, who had some political affiliation with Charles Taylor, but it really is a serial entrepreneur in the urban centers of Liberia as well as the peri-urban centers. So he comes to the race with sort of a level of experience, having been an entrepreneur and sort of made his own money. Another person who's a new aspirant is Coca-Cola former COO, Alex Cummings, who ran Coca-Cola for almost 25 years and is a self-made billionaire. So he comes with that sort of technocratic entrepreneur experience. And that sort of muddies the waters a little bit for these seasoned politicians, because what it absolutely shows is that the presidential race is not the sole domain of these seasoned politicians any longer, that there are going to be people who will challenge their clout. And have been able to galvanize a large population of people, not only in the urban centers, but also in rural areas. Another person, not an entrepreneur, but a technocrat, is the former central bank governor, Mills Jones, who's also entered the race. And his party is, I think, the Movement for Economic Empowerment. So he's done a lot of work in rural areas, particularly around market women, giving them loans and access to collateral and credit. And I think that gives some of the seasoned politicians a bit of a run for their money. Another person who's come to the fore is a former technocrat as well, the former Auditor General of Liberia, John Morlew, who in 2009 said a statement that was absolutely unsubstantiated but created a lot of problems for the president when he said that the president's administration was 3 times more corrupt, or 10 times more corrupt. It was a wild figure, 10 times more corrupt than the previous National Transitional Government of Liberia. So he's very much a firebrand, somebody who has worked in auditing and has exposed a lot of the graft that has happened in the public sector. So many people in the rural areas as well as the urban areas see him as a messiah, an anti-corruption messiah. Again, giving the seasoned politicians a bit of a run for their money, making them a bit uncomfortable in their positions, which I think is very, very important. I think one of the other things that has come to the fore is that a lot of the standard bearers of their parties who are going to be running for president have realized that they cannot win in the first round, that there has to be some coalition building. So you find that a lot of opposition parties are coming together to form coalitions. There was a large meeting of 12 heads of opposition parties in Ganta earlier last year, where they agreed to form coalitions or even splinter coalitions amongst themselves. And the one that came to the fore that's, I would say, more powerful than the rest is George Weah, the former football player who did run for president in 2005 and then ran for vice president in 2011. So him, and then also Jewel Howard Taylor, the former First Lady of Liberia and Charles Taylor's wife. Now they are going to be running as president and vice president for a coalition called the Congress for Democratic Change, or the Coalition for Democratic Change. And I think that's a very hot ticket because they're bringing constituents from across the country, not only in their ethno-regional bases, but also bases that the president won in 2011 that will be sticking points for the vice president. 2 or 3 other things that I think are important to think about when you're thinking about October 2017 for Liberia is the enforcement of certain laws. And I'll list them off because I think they're incredibly important to name. So Liberia has a 10-year residency clause. And this clause explicitly states that if you have not resided in Liberia for 10 consecutive years, you cannot be eligible to run for the presidency. Now, this creates problems for people like Alex Cummings, who has been a diasporic Liberian. He's been transnational. He's sort of traveled back and forth, but has sat in his sort of entrepreneur perch with Coca-Cola and hasn't lived in Liberia. Another person that might create problems for is John Morlew, the former Auditor General, who after not being re-nominated in 2011, left and started his own auditing firm in the United States in 2011. So has lived in Washington, D.C. effectively for the past 5 years. Now, this particular clause was supposed to be implemented in 2011, but there were some issues with the referendum vote. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court definitively stated that it would be enforced in 2017. I don't hear very many people talking about this clause, but I think it will come to the fore when there are contestations around who is eligible to actually run. I think another law that's important to bring up is Liberia does not recognize dual citizenship. So if you are a Liberian and you naturalize in another country, you automatically revoke your Liberian citizenship. There is a bill that's before the legislature. It hasn't been passed yet, but it has called into question the citizenship of a number of candidates. So people like Alex Cummings, who has mooted to have gained U.S. citizenship. People like even George Weah, who's mooted to have French citizenship. For people like Mills Jones, who's mooted to have U.S. citizenship, and even the former Auditor General. So again, if these laws are invoked and enforced, and people start, rumblings around whether or not these people are actually eligible, it could create a sort of constitutional quagmire. I think another law that's incredibly important is that there was a 2014 Civil Service Conduct Law, which basically stated that anyone who is running for political office, whether for the legislature or for the presidency, has to resign from his or her political office 2 years before the actual election. There are a number of people who are vying for the presidency as well as the House of Representatives, because it's a legislative as well as presidential race, who did not resign 2 years before the elections this year. So again, whether or not that particular code of conduct will be enforced is a big question mark. And the last one, which I think is particularly peculiar to Liberia, perhaps it's similar in other countries, but in 2012, the legislature, which already has a very bloated budget, decided to fatten up their pockets a little bit more by introducing a law that is called the Democracy Sustainability Act. And this act, and I hear some people laughing already, but this act basically says that the first, second, and third parties that come in first, second, and third places in the presidential as well as the legislative elections will be given $2 million, $1 million, and $500,000 respectively as campaign finance for subsequent elections. Now, as you can imagine, Liberia is a post-war country. We're already in a deficit. People during the Ebola outbreak didn't even have gloves. They didn't have running water. They didn't have food to eat. And so you're taking a national budget line and giving it to parties that come in first, second, and third in the legislative as well as presidential race. It's created a lot of problems for the legislature that passed this. But what's important about this is that the stakes are high in the sense that any party or coalition that wins first, second, and third has a fat check that they'll get at the end of the elections. again, for subsequent campaigning. Talk about campaign finance regulations need to happen in Liberia, but it's caused a lot of problems, particularly for the public who's looked at this and said this is absolutely ridiculous. And I think last but certainly not least, a couple of other issues. The United Nations mission in Liberia has drawn down. They have effectively given full responsibility of Liberia's security to the government of Liberia. Now, this will be the first time they'll have a very small, limited force, police force as well as a security force. In 2005, there was a force of about 5,000, 7,000 people. This year, it'll be less than 2,000 people. And so the question is, what does that say about the security of the elections? Is it safe? Will there be skirmishes here and there? And is our national police and our armed forces able to respond to any sort of security rifts? Then the other thing is the experience of Ebola. I think a lot of Liberians, having had this tactile experience, realize that the candidates who are most viable are those who can respond to these existential threats. And then beyond that, you talked about the fact that it's an issues race. And 2017 is an issues race. It's not about personality, the cult of the personality. People are actually asking questions about, what is your track record? What have you delivered in the past 6 to 12 years? Why should we trust you? I'll give you a very sort of anecdotal evidence of that. In 2006, when President Sirleaf took office, at the time I was working for her as her communications special assistant. There were 5 women in her cabinet, 5 technocrats. One had come from the World Bank, another had worked for the UN for a long period of time. So women who were obviously very qualified. There were also 5 superintendents. Now, superintendents are people who represent the president in the 15 sub-political divisions of Liberia. 5 out of 15, so a third of the superintendents were women. In terms of the senatorial and legislative votes, I think there were about 10 to 13 women, both in the House and the Senate. If you look at the dispensation now in 2017, there are only 2 cabinet officials who are women, one of whom is a gender minister. And I feel like that's a bit of a token position. The other person is the executive director of the National Investment Commission, which is less of a ministerial post. If you look at the senatorial spaces as well as the legislative spaces, there are only 2 women from 13 who've been voted in office. And then the superintendents, I think about 2. So between 2006, when President Sirleaf took office, and 2017, when she's about to step down, there are fewer women explicitly, vocally, in political office than when she actually took office. And we can have a debate about why that is, but I think one of the things that for me has been disappointing is there was a gender equity bill that was put forward by the Women's Legislative Caucus in Liberia. And there have been gender equity bills across the continent. I think Sierra Leone had one. If you look at Rwanda, which has 60% plus 60% women in parliament, they have a quota system. The women in Liberia, particularly in the legislative caucus, said that we needed a quota system because that was the only way to bring women into political office so that they would have the support that they needed to run in these various elections. The president was very silent on this particular bill. She didn't support it initially, and when she eventually did sign on board, it was sort of a resigned kind of acceptance of it. Now, the bill effectively was not passed because I think the men in the Senate and the House were concerned about this quota system. And I think that had some sort of effect on the psychology of the voters and the electorate in terms of why should we allow women to have a bit of an edge when even the president is not supporting it, who is a woman herself, who's worked in political office for the past 40 years. If she's not supporting this bill, then it probably means that women have to work on merit. They have to get there through their own devices. We shouldn't give them an extra advantage. I think another thing that she has done that I think has been incredibly positive is that she's brought a lot of younger women into her political sort of inner circle, and I benefited quite concretely from that. But I think in the past 5 years, there's almost been a turn where if you look at her cabinet now, and I'm sorry I don't have photos, most of the people who are ministers are young men in their 30s and their 40s. As I said before, there are only 2 women who are in ministerial posts. And so the question that a lot of young women are asking is, what about us? Is the glass ceiling so high that our president, who's a woman, hasn't completely shattered it? And if so, why not? So, her legacy is mixed in that result, but I think she came in with a lot of expectations about how she would transform the country for women. And in many respects, she's done a really fantastic job of carving out the space for women to enter entrepreneurial ventures. So she's a huge supporter of market women. She's built markets across the country. There's a Sirleaf Market Women's Fund that has given donations to market women, that has enabled them to have microcredit loans, that has built markets, again, large markets all across the country. And I think that's been great, giving women sort of the financial clout, again, to be able to access credit. But in the economy, yes, we're trying to empower women, but I think in terms of politics or the political sphere, I don't think we've done enough.